Our guest tonight is Kevin Ambrose. If you all can remember way back to January when we were talking about why it was so cold out, he came and gave a presentation with his colleague from the Capitol Weather Gang. Those beautiful photographs you see in the Washington Post and on WashingtonPost.com of weather systems around are taken by Kevin. And when he was here giving that presentation, he was talking about some of the other projects he's worked on, and he brought up this amazing story of the Centreville Six, and I will not steal his thunder by telling you why I found it so compelling. I will let him do that. But if he looks familiar, that's because he's heard him talking about blizzards back in January. It's hard to picture blizzards now. But here he is, Kevin Ambrose.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Very good. So I actually tell a lot of stories. I tell weather stories, Civil War stories, I've got some running stories, but my favorite story of them all is the story of the day I found a Civil War soldier. My friends love it, my family loves it, I've told it many, many times, and it's one of the stories I really have a hard time finishing because there's just so much to it. But tonight, with this venue, with our time slot, I can get through pretty much the entire story at a good level of depth and kind of frame everything that happened in the sequence of events, because really just finding the soldier was the very first part. The sequence of events that followed, solving the mystery of their identity, going back and discovering the history of the soldiers, that's what really makes the story special. But still, finding the soldier is what most people want to hear first. So let me just kind of go through the timeline, just sort of set the context for the presentation, and then I'll show you where I'm going to jump into the story and progress. So at the beginning of the Civil War, a group of young men signed up for the Civil War. They were signing up all across the United States to huge celebrations. The war had not started. They had not seen death. There were parades. There were feasts, lots of singing and cheers, and it was no different for our group of soldiers that we're going to discuss tonight. But they did encounter their first battle. Things changed, and a number of the very young men were killed in battle and buried on the field and left behind. And ultimately, they were forgotten. Completely forgotten until a day in 1994 when I accidentally discovered them relic hunting. And I'll give you the whole story about the relic hunting piece. That led to an amazing excavation led by the Smithsonian Institution, teamed with Fairfax County Archaeologists, to basically remove the remains. And what was so cool about the fact that the Smithsonian Institution led the effort, they were able to bring the remains back here and do a full-scale forensic analysis. Oftentimes, that does not happen for remains. But Dr. Doug Owsley was plugged into the event. He is the foremost forensic anthropologist, and he took our soldiers' remains and did an amazing investigation. I'm going to discuss that here tonight. Amazing, surprisingly, with the clues in the graves and the clues from the forensic study, not only were we able to determine who the soldiers were, we were able to pin names to the different graves. Not 100%, but fairly good accuracy. Based on that, based on the data, the state of Massachusetts and the military accepted the conclusions, and there was a full-scale military burial with honors. And I'll go into that in this presentation as well. But like I said, when I ever tell this story, my friends want me to jump right into, how do you find a soldier? I mean, come on, you don't walk through the woods and discover a skeleton in the leaves. You don't really dig them up either. It's something that is very uncommon to find. And it truly was quite a surprise when I did find it. So let me set the context of the discovery. I'm going to start the story here, kind of run through and then jump backwards. So that's the timeline for the presentation. So let me jump into it, setting the context of the discovery, where it happened. It happened in Centreville, just south of the Route 28-29 intersection. This is Google Maps. If you were to go there now, McDonald's is right here on Route 28. Route 29 is up here. The multiplex is down here. Really, all you're going to find in Centreville these days is a parking spot. But it was much, much different 20 years ago when I found the soldier. This is how it looked in 1994 when I found the grave. This was a hilltop covered with pine trees along Route 28, which was a Civil War period road. It followed the old roadbed towards Manassas. And this hilltop was a favorite relic hunting location for me and my friends. It was developer-owned, we had permission, It was slated to be developed, and they didn't really care if we went in and just metal detected. So we went in there for years. And the irony of the discovery is we found the grave in probably the most metal detected location in the state of Virginia, and it took years because obviously graves are buried deep. So this is what the location looked like in the winter of 1861-62. It's not the exact location, but this is Centreville. It quickly got covered by camps. Every tree and fence post quickly got cut down for firewood, and it was just a very desolate area, very heavily traveled. So hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through Centreville during the Civil War. So let's talk about the relic hunting piece. That's kind of how this whole story started and how the graves were found. When I tell the story to my friends, I sometimes forget, a lot of people don't really relic hunt and know what's involved. So what I want to do is kind of just give you sort of an overview. Most of you probably will know this, but it's usually done with metal detectors. You basically scan the ground. The detectors will go down anywhere up to 12 to 15 inches, typically for an artifact. They have discrimination. You're looking for something that is gold, silver, non-ferrous. They discriminate fairly well. And in the course of metal detecting this camp, I had made some pretty cool discoveries. The Louisiana troops, along with Virginia and a little Texas unit, had camped on that hill very heavily. And what we found there mostly were Confederate artifacts. And if you look at sort of the collecting in general, Confederate artifacts are the prized artifacts. They're a lot fewer. Not that we sell them, but they have higher value. And this is Louisiana, this is Mississippi, this is Texas, Virginia, and this really cool gold wedding ring I still wear, I found it in the camp. And the funny story is, my wife doesn't find it funny, but I find it a little funny. I lost my wedding ring relic hunting in 1994. It was just a regular old wedding ring, and within 2 or 3 months, I was procrastinating and getting another one. I find this beautiful handmade gold band, 22 karat, probably made in New Orleans, that fit. And I'm thinking, how cool is that? And I've got this relic now, and my wife's like, yeah, I bet you'll never lose that one because it's a relic. 20 years later, I'm still wearing it. But so really, most of how I found this ring and how I found these buttons and the plate, the U.S. buckle could have been lost by Confederates or Unions traveling through. There were so many soldiers going through that area. I found all of these just what I call surface hunting, just swinging the detector, listening for signals. You hear a beep, sounds good, you dig it up. Lots of times you dig up pop tabs, lots of junk, and it takes a lot of digging to get the good artifacts. But over time, we accumulated a lot of nice buttons. When the easy signals start running out, you start looking for the trash pits. That's what I'm doing here. This is a photo of me back in the 90s, and it looks like I'm opening up a grave, but you don't ever expect to find a grave in a camp. So you open up the trash pit, you're listening for big, deep iron signals. And as you get into them, a lot of times they're horseshoes, pieces of stove parts. You'll find bones, a lot of items that they ate with, their forks and knives. And what you're hoping for is they threw a uniform in the trash, or they threw a belt or a bayonet. And it's rare they do, but if you dig enough of these trash pits, oftentimes you'll come across a nice item. I have found uniforms in trash pits, entire uniforms. So it's something that we tend to do after we've sort of cherry-picked the easy signals out of the camp. So this camp, here's a photo of that pine hill that you saw earlier. Like I said, was a favorite location for us to hunt for years. But by 1994, the year of the discovery of the grave, we had pretty much exhausted every signal that was easy to find, both trash pits and surface hunting with our metal detectors, and I pretty much stopped visiting the site. And I was talking to a couple of my friends one night at a club meeting, and I had a real good friend who was bragging about his new metal detector. It was made by Fisher, and I had a metal detector made by White's. And he was saying his detector can go deeper than my detector, and like, yeah, okay, whatever. And one thing led to another, and we decided we were going to have a competition in the field. I said, hey, I know the perfect spot. This is the most hunted out, dug out spot in all of Northern Virginia. Everyone's been hunting it for 3 years. Let's go to this little hilltop in Centreville and see if we can find anything. And if your detector is as good as you say, you'll find a button deeper than any of the buttons that we had dug. So we show up there. We actually went to breakfast at Payne's Diner in Centreville, and then we went out to the woods. And I took my detector, because this was now a competition, and I turned up the sensitivity to the point where it was unstable. It was just picking up power lines, chattering. But I knew my detector well enough, and I could tell some deep signals. And it took about 30 minutes, and I got some just very faint, deep iron signals. And I started digging into the iron signals, and some pieces of wood and square nails, which is very, very common in a hut site or trash pit, started coming up. And this is what was coming up. So I'm just thinking, man, I've got a hut site going down about 18, 22 inches. And then I started coming across these little bones. And I really wasn't too perplexed. I find all kinds of bones of different shapes and sizes. The soldiers ate very well the first winter of the war, but never something like that. But I didn't think too much about it. But what really got me worried and perplexed is when I found two parallel bones. Now let me say, these photos are not from the day I found it. This is from when we reopened it up. I did not have the composure to think, let me start photographing all these finds, because it was such a common occurrence to dig a trash pit. But this is what I did see, the two bones parallel. Now I'd only uncovered just a few inches of it, but in all my digging of all the hundreds of different types of ham bones and cow bones and pork bones that I'd come across, never were two thin parallel bones laid together like immediately I thought a grave. But then I also thought, I just can't go to Fairfax County and say, hey, I found two parallel bones and a bunch of little bones. I think it's a feet and leg bones. I need some more evidence before I report it. So I paced up about 2 feet and I dug a test hole. And when I hit the test hole, it was very interesting. It was something I did not expect. And keep in mind, I'm not doing an archaeological dig. I'm just punching a test hole into the ground. So I'm going pretty quick and sloppy, which archaeologists cringe at, but I was just trying to determine what was happening. I came out with a 4-inch wafer, and it was bored on either side. And as I peeled the board off, I saw a uniform cloth with brass buttons. And it was real faded, kind of brownish wool cloth that kind of just crumbled. Underneath was very faded white cloth with milk glass buttons. Then there were some thin bones, like would have been rib bones, and the layer repeated. The cloth, without the buttons, of course, and then the wood. So I knew at this point it was a grave. So I filled the holes back in, and I went back to my friend who was off metal detecting a different part of the hill. And he was a much older gentleman. He'd been relic hunting probably for 25 plus years. And I told him about my discovery, and he laughed at me. He said, dude, you just found a trash pit with some chicken bones and a uniform, and you just freaked yourself out. He goes, you don't find graves in camps. You just don't. I've done this my entire life. My dad did this. Graves are not in camps. They just don't bury their dead in camps. They put them somewhere else. It is a trash pit, I guarantee you. And I'm like, I don't know. I found this layer, and he's like, there was a floorboard, there were some bones, a uniform. Come on, it can rearrange itself. And he said, did you find a skull? And I said, no, I didn't find a skull. I said, I wasn't digging, I just dug a test hole. He goes, come on, let's see if there's a skull there, and then we'll confirm it. He was still kind of laughter in his eyes. You could tell he just did not believe it. And I showed him where the hole was, and really it's just a nondescript area in the woods. And he's like, okay, start digging. I'm like, I'm not gonna dig. It's like, I already know what it is. He goes, well, do you mind if I do? And it's like, okay, well, here's the test hole. Here's where I think I found the feet. The skull should be right in that area. And it was going into the hillside, so he was going to have to dig probably 30 inches down to get to it. I dug almost 20 where the feet were. So he starts digging, and we start talking, and after a while, it's taking him so long, we're just chatting about other things. I'm almost forgetting our objective, and then a skull rolls out. And he looks at me, and I said, I told you so. And so we fill everything back in, and we notified Fairfax County. This was 1994. That's Mike Johnson, the chief archaeologist. And I was tremendously worried because you might know the controversy or the debate between relic hunting versus archaeology. There's a little bit of conflict, and probably even 1994 is worse than it is now. As far as archaeologists think relic hunting should not be done in general. It disturbs the context of the discovery. And for the most part, I totally agree with their arguments, especially with historic locations. But in a site like Centreville in much of Northern Virginia that's about to be bulldozed away, if you don't dig it up in the next month, it's going to be completely swept away by the dozers and panners and gone. So this was what context where I felt like it was good to be relic hunting, but I was so worried that my name would be tied to grave digging, looting, and I was just cringing that I was going to be in the paper. Kevin Ambrose, grave looter. Fairfax County finds his sloppily dug, I just had all these worries and concerns, but I did the right thing and reported it. And he turned out to be a really great guy. Totally understands the hobby. I told him at the University of Virginia, I actually studied archaeology. I've been to many digs, considered being an archaeologist, so I've got the passion for it. And we got along really well together. The problem happened just because you report a grave, everyone's busy, everyone's got their own projects. It just sort of got forgotten. As time went on, Fairfax County knew it had been reported. The site was slated for development, but it wasn't happening in the next week. The guy whose job it was at Fairfax County to investigate it took another job. And so suddenly in '97, over 2.5 years later, I'm driving by and they're bulldozing the site. So I quickly called Fairfax County, the guy I talked to, and said, they're bulldozing. You haven't gone in and removed it. I only knew where it was. And he's like, no, I didn't know they were even bulldozing it. The guy who was supposed to look after the project has moved on. So they quickly called the owner of the property. It had changed hand to McDonald's Corporation. They had contracted out to a huge construction crew, and they shut down the effort temporarily. Just, hey, stop it right now. We're going to investigate. If it turns out to be a grave, we might have to actually shut it down for a few days. If it's not, you'll be ready to go the next day. So this is where it got interesting for me. I was told to immediately go out there that evening after work to show some officials where I found the grave. So I was greeted by members from the Smithsonian Institute, here, here, and here. That's Mike Johnson, Chief Archaeologist of Fairfax County. That's me. And I walk into those woods 2.5 years later. I thought I had memorized exactly the spot in the tree. It changes. 2.5 years, the woods change. And I start poking around. And after a while, I'm talking 5 or 10 minutes, I'm starting to get a little worried. I can't exactly find my spot. And I see the people shooting glances at each other like, did we just waste our evening? And I remembered, and I did this on purpose, I lumped a whole bunch of beer cans together at the site just so I could find it again with a metal detector in case I needed to. Thank goodness I did, because I never dreamed I would forget where it was. And then I heard that pile of metal cans, and I scraped it, and I felt the dirt underneath was kind of soft, so I called them all over, and they broke out the hose, and we cut down the little tree that I thought I was going to remember, but I didn't. And we saw where I had dug the digging. It was a darker shade in the earth. And with that, they told the corporation that was developing, we want 1 day. Just give us 1 day to remove this body. Well, then they decided to scrape the topsoil just to check out the area, because oftentimes when there's one grave, there's more than, there's others in rows. Here's the meeting of the group trying to discuss the planning of the situation. You've got Smithsonian, McDonald's, you've got Fairfax County officials, and some construction foremen, all kind of discussing how long will their project be delayed. They were not happy to delay a big project like that. Doug Owsley, Dr. Doug Owsley, well-known person here at the Smithsonian Institution, forensic anthropologist. He came in and started probing where they had cleared, and immediately found what he thought were 5 other grave shafts. So they told the construction crew, it's going to be 3 days. We're going to do an emergency salvage operation. So for archaeologists, 3 days is a fast dig. Usually they go down very slowly through the layers. So this is Doug probing. After he probed and scraped, they mapped out where they thought the grave shafts were. And once you really clear the topsoil, if you've ever done archaeology, you can see the color changes in the earth. So you can kind of see rough rectangles where shafts had been dug into the ground. And they mapped them with tape and planned a dig. Fairfax County Police were called in to watch the site at night, just in case someone wanted to run in and dig at night, which probably would never have happened, but just to be safe, the Fairfax County Police patrolled the site. And volunteers, archaeologists, Smithsonian Institution workers, almost anyone on that first day was allowed to help with the dig. There were 6 grave shafts to excavate. and a lot of dirt to sift because every speck of dirt that went down through the grave shaft had to be sifted and documented. In one of the grave shafts, there was a troublesome tree. You'll see other photos from the roots of this. It was a constant challenge. And what happened, the volunteers broke into grave teams. So if you chose grave 2, that was your grave through the whole dig. You didn't jump to grave 3. You basically went with your team all the way down to the point where the remains are removed. So I believe this was grave 5. That team had so many fits with the roots that they had to constantly keep cutting, but it was done. The News 4, Channel 4, NBC 4, heard about the dig, and they came in and covered the event. I've got the video footage from 1997. I thought it'd be kind of cool to watch. You get to hear Dr. Doug Owsley interviewed, his perspective of the dig. You get to see a version of me from 1997 interviewed. So let me see if I can pull this off here.
The third day of the dig, but the hard part begins when they remove the remains from this location. They'll take them to the lab where they'll try to determine their age, their size, and what caused their death.
Show them through so they can get the photographs. We're getting too many people inside the yellow line. Thank you.
Excellent. Ready? Good. All right. Say your name, please.
It's Doug Owsley.
Spell your last name, Doug.
It's O-W-S-L-E-Y.
Okay, and your position?
I'm a curator and division head for the Department of Anthropology, National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution.
Tell me about the find here. What happens next? Now that you got your 6 graves, what happens next? You've identified 6 soldiers.
Right. They had information that there was possibly one here, and so I received an emergency phone call, came out and looked at it, and we did some initial probing. It indicated that there were probably others, so we took the topsoil off, and based on that, defined the burial shafts, and we're taking them out.
Yeah. Does the hard work start now? I mean, of identifying what they died of and all that kind of stuff?
Well, this is just the very beginning of it. What we would do is very carefully excavate them, define as much information as we can in the field, take some basic measurements in the field, but they'll now go to the laboratory at the Smithsonian Institution, and we'll examine each one of the individuals and see what they can tell us about who they are.
What sort of stuff are you going to be looking for during these examinations?
Well, they would be handled just as any type of forensic investigation, any investigation that we might do for police as well as for historic and prehistoric sites. From the bones, they can tell you volumes. They can tell you how old the person is. They can tell you the sex, how tall the person is, how robust. We'll be looking at indications as to evidence of disease, looking for any signs of cause of death.
Yeah, like bullet wounds or anything like that?
Any type of trauma, that'd be one of the things that we'd look for.
Good enough.
Well, it's very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time. We'll certainly do a number of different types of examination, including conventional X-rays, and look at some of the bones under microscopes and things like that. It'll take me some time.
Excellent. And when you talk about some time, estimate like 6 months or?
Well, I probably should have my preliminary analysis completed within 6 months on these, but there's different. Check the history books, any sort of historical records for this area to see what that can tell us. So you've got the archaeological information, what we're learning
from looking at it. Can you tell whether they're Confederate or Union?
Well, there's a lot of military uniform parts still around it. Let me say that again. There's a number of different types of materials present in the burials that can tell us who they might represent. We have fabric, we have a number of different buttons found at each type of military.
Teeth are there. Yeah. Strike.
Very clearly.
Don't be nervous. Just because you're on camera. That's right.
Can I get your autograph, lady?
Your name?
Kevin Ambrose,
Spell your last name, Kevin.
Ambrose.
You discovered the first grave.
That's right.
How did you manage to do that?
Well, this is a big Louisiana camp, an 1861 camp, and I was metal detecting, looking for trash pits. And I guess I heard the coffin nails. They're about maybe 18 inches down. And when I dug into it, I bumped into the skull, filled it all back in, and we notified authorities. And it's taken about 2.5 years to put this whole thing together. It was kind of interesting. The Smithsonian's here, the Fairfax County Archaeological Society's here, my club is here, and even the construction crews are helping out, just clearing trees and the ground.
Finding a site like this, how does that make you feel?
It was actually kind of eerie, a little unsettling when I first found it, but it's kind of nice to see it all, taking place as it is now, and everything going right, and the soldiers will be moved to a church graveyard.
Will make you feel good?
Better, yeah. I did not like stumbling upon it at first, but it's nice to see that it's not going to be bulldozed over without ever having been found.
No, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Your name?
My name's Denise Faye.
Spell your last name.
F-A-Y-N-E.
Okay, what do you think about what's going on?
I think it's fabulous. I happen to be a history major, so and the Civil War has always been a real interest of mine. And anytime something like this is going on, I want my children to be a part of it and have some exposure to it.
Ignore the camera. Baby. Look
Ignore
at
the
me.
camera.
All right, good enough. You're a history major, and there's historical value. You wanted your daughters to be a part of it, or what?
Absolutely, absolutely. I just happened to hear about it. Our doctor's office is next door. I had one of my children here, and one of the nurses was telling us about it, so we came flying over here. We've lived in Centreville for about 10 years, and I think this is the first time since we've been here that there's been a historical find of this nature. I mean, Centreville's rich with the history of Civil War battles. We all know that. But to find something like this so close to home is really fascinating.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is the third day of the dig.
I had this issue earlier. Here we go. So one thing that I mentioned in the interview was they were going to a church graveyard. There was a church in Centreville that volunteered their graveyard for the soldiers' remains. At the time, we fully expected that the soldiers would be unidentified. We wouldn't know if they were Union or Confederate. The types of uniforms are fairly generic. I really felt strongly they were Union, but some of my colleagues really felt strongly they were Confederate because of the location where they were buried. And as an unknown, everyone figured we were just going to put them into this church graveyard that was nearby. That had happened one other time with a grave that had been found many years earlier. But what ultimately happened was clues came out which helped us identify the soldiers, and that'll be a big piece of what I'm going to be talking about here shortly. The other thing that came out of the video, which I don't know if you noticed, they were interviewing some of the bystanders. There were police lines that were drawn up around the dig. Hundreds of spectators would come out during the day to watch. And what was very nice, members of the Smithsonian Institution and Fairfax County volunteers would pull aside families and bring them under the police lines and give them tours. And as soon as the tour was done, they'd pick up another family or another group and give them a tour. So pretty much everyone who came to see it got a chance to walk through the site and get a real close look at what was going on. So it was really neat to see that happening. It was quite an event. Here's a scene on the first day. Everyone kind of breaking up into their grave teams and getting dirty. It was done in late January, early February, so it was not brutally cold. It was a good thing it wasn't done this past winter, but the temperature was pretty much in the 40s and 50s throughout the 3 days, and one day we had light rain, which really wasn't too bad. They had tarps, but they covered the different graves up at night. Once the shaft was dug to the level of the remains, it was a very slow process to dig the dirt out from the bones and really do a lot of measuring. This is where the team from the Smithsonian Institution came in. They documented extremely well, almost a full day of documenting and measuring and writing down information about every grave that was excavated. You can see Owsley right there. Here's one of the construction foremans, a couple volunteers. And this is kind of interesting. I'd mentioned the comment about relic hunting and archaeology don't mix oftentimes. They actually work very well together. Even I even heard comments from the archaeologists about this. The teams, the grave teams that had relic hunters, we had our detectors going the entire time. We did not miss a single artifact that was metallic as we went down to the grave shaft. The buttons, the nails, everything was pulled out because we heard it with the detectors. The teams that did not use detecting had a lot of the artifacts sifted out later, just because a lot of times small things you don't see. And I even had Mike Johnson mention that he thinks that archaeologists should use metal detectors more often in their process. And some do, but I found that very interesting. And the groups, like I said, worked very well together. One of the graves had a crushed skull, and a lot of times the analysis is what happened. And the thought on this one was the weight of the dozer or someone walking over top was probably what was just enough to crush it, unfortunately. But only one of 6 tenant was crushed. Here's a close-up of the volunteers. Like I mentioned, there were many different volunteers that were involved in the dig. And if you got involved on the first day, you were allowed to dig all 3 days. And most people just took off work like I did. So here are the 6 soldiers as they're in the ground, graves 1 through 6. Whoops. Here's our tree root growing right through the skull of one of the soldiers. And that was, like I mentioned, an issue all the way down, clearing up those roots. Many people commented on this guy's expression as he stared at you while you were digging. This was the skull that I had unearthed. And we'll be looking at this soldier a little more closely. He played a very important role in the forensic analysis. So here's grave 3. You can see the black organic matter. There was a lot of coffin material, pine boards that had to be removed. I don't have photos. It really didn't make for good photos, just sort of brown in a hole. On the spine, you can see the board that kind of warped over the discs. So that is coffin board right there. A lot of the uniform cloth has been removed, but you can see organic matter has stained the soil dark, whereas arms, you can see the rib bones. There's an important clue that we had in this particular grave. The next photo shows it more closely. There is a shoulder button. It's an eagle button. Many uniforms in the Civil War did not have shoulder buttons. Buttons were down the front. They had epaulets, they had shoulder scales, but not many uniforms put a button up on the shoulder. So that became a very important clue for us a little bit later. Here's our tree grave again. A close-up, and you see some of the white glass buttons that got scattered about. That was from the underwear that the soldier was wearing. Here's Owsley with an assistant. He even pitched in and did the sifting. The sifting was the non-glamorous work, but everyone took their turn sifting the dirt. And what was interesting, after the dirt was sifted, it was still hauled away in buckets and washed away. So it was pretty much sifted twice. And there are a few little fragments came out of the dirt, so it is a definitely worthwhile effort. Now this is a really fascinating piece of evidence that we later found out more about. This soldier was not wearing boots, he was wearing athletic shoes, almost like a version of a Converse or a canvas top. Most of us didn't even know they existed until we found this soldier wearing them. All the other soldiers did not have boots. So one soldier's wearing athletic shoes. Athletic shoes really were not worn in the Civil War. Common issue boots, you read about it everywhere. So it's very strange for this one soldier to have athletic shoes on. Whoops. Here's where the laces went. This would have been canvas and just sort of a leather sole. Low rider, just like a sneaker, basically. I'll tell you, we'll talk more about this later as we do the analysis of the remains. But it really was a curiosity and definitely a talking point during the dig. Everyone wanted to see the shoes. Here's the police lines, and here's a volunteer, or actually a Smithsonian member taking spectators in to look at the dig. Finally, the last root had to be cut. The remains had to be removed from the gravesite and taken back to the Smithsonian. Here is one of the Smithsonian institution members lifting the skull. And that was always sort of a powerful moment when you finally pull a skull out and hold it in your hands. Really only the Smithsonian workers did that. The buttons from the dig, you can see grave 1, 3, and down here grave 6. They're pretty much all the same. They were eagle buttons, small size. Kind of a generic button. I'll talk more about the buttons later when we do the analysis. But nothing special about them. They were not Louisiana buttons. Here were the underwear buttons. They're milk glass buttons. You see the dime just for context of the size. There really was a lot of cloth in the graves. The grave I dug had huge portions of the front of the uniform still intact. It was amazing, though, after 2.5 years, almost every bit of the uniform had disappeared. Just exposing it to oxygen and leaving it in the ground for 2.5 years, the decay was super accelerated. I was very disappointed. It would have been wonderful to have dug that in the same fashion as the others, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. So this is interesting, and particularly for me. I was an arrowhead hunter in the area for years and years. One of the soldiers in grave 3 had a crude arrowhead in his pocket. And the Fairfax County archaeologists who specialize in Indian artifacts loved it, and they knew exactly what type it was. You had people who were not into Indian artifacts saying, well, it kind of looks just like a rock. But if you know your arrowheads, it's definitely been chipped on the edges. It's a triangular point, a very common type of point, and it's made out of quartzite, which is a very common material for arrowheads. So it's definitely an arrowhead, just not a very good one. But it was a souvenir that the soldier had picked up and placed in his pocket before he was killed, and was buried with it in his pocket. Another soldier was buried with unfired bullets in his pocket, which is a more common find you'd expect. But what it told us was that this soldier, and probably all the soldiers that were buried in these graves, were using buck and ball. It was basically a musket ball with 3 buckshot. Very, very common ammunition in the Civil War. It goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, where George Washington said that was the most effective type of ammunition to use in the Revolutionary War, buck and ball. So they were still using it at the very beginning of the Civil War. As the 3 days ended and the construction crews were actually revving up their equipment and bulldozing trees around us, the remains were boxed and bagged and sent back to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. We had no idea. We had heard Doug say it might take 6 months to a year for the analysis. And quite frankly, we didn't really think that we'd find any evidence on who the soldiers were. We're kind of interested really to see if they were killed in battle, if he would find any gunshot wounds, any evidence of death besides disease. Because we all figured they probably was killed in battle, just by the nature of the burial. But we weren't sure. So all the 6 remains were taken back here, and the analysis began. They were cleaned very carefully, and I just put a comparison here, grave 2, 3, and 5, how they looked in the ground and after Doug and his crew cleaned the skulls. I won't really go through the detailed comments. I'll sort of do a summary of the forensic analysis in a couple minutes here. What they were trying to do is determine the nature of the soldier's life, from diet, disease, injuries, and the cause of death. And even after death, what might have happened post-mortem. Like this tree root, obviously, is easy to say the skull was crushed by the tree, not by a blow to the head. But all of that kind of analysis was done here at the Smithsonian. This was the biggest piece of forensic evidence that we found. The soldier in grave 3, the same soldier that had the button on his shoulder, had been shot cleanly through the head. There was an entrance wound and an exit wound. This is the exit wound where the bullet came out and where it cracked his skull. So he was definitely killed in battle. It makes sense that all the other soldiers were killed in battle as well. But this was definite evidence that confirmed it. There was no evidence of disease that was found, but one soldier had been killed by a bullet. The X-ray, which was really interesting, showed there was still lead in his skull. So not all of the bullet or the projectile made it out. So what they did here was they went into the skull cavity and removed the lead, the pieces of bullet that were left over. And most of the bullet came out of the exit hole. But along the edges, it's hard to see, there are fragments of lead. So here are those fragments of lead. There are 3, which is a little unusual. A large fragment, which probably was the main bullet, but 2 little fragments that were separate from it, which led us to believe it was the most common ammunition of the early war, buck and ball. The .69 caliber round ball made it clean through the skull. Maybe a piece of it was shaved off in the skull itself. It's possible all 3 of these were from the buck, but probably one piece was shaved off from the round ball. But at least some of this we felt was from the buckshot. So we kind of know the ammunition that was used to kill the soldiers, the same ammunition they were using to fire against their enemy. They did the tooth wear, just slight wear of teeth. It helps identify the age as well as some of the bone evidence. One of the soldiers had a very badly broken jaw that had healed. So he'd probably broken his jaw early in his life. The fracture is here, and it damaged a tooth. And that could help if you were able to find evidence of a soldier that had an injury before he went into the war. And now here's kind of the summary of what Dr. Owsley found from doing the analysis here. Grave 1, young kid, 17 to 20. He had possible malnutrition as a child. Grave 2, this was really interesting, 16 to 18. You're supposed to be 18 when you enter the Civil War. This was someone who most likely faked his age and went in early, and 5'8". Grave 3, the guy with the broken jaw and had been shot through the head, he was 28 to 35. Grave 4, 22 to 26, he had very well-developed hands and arms, probably some sort of laborer as a profession before he entered the war. Grave 5, older, 29 to 36, 5'7", a lot of tobacco stains on the teeth, which actually is very common. What's interesting is you don't have a lot of tobacco stains on the other soldiers because they're very young. But Civil War soldiers, and I've excavated many trash pits, they were pipe smokers, both north and south. And it was very uncommon for a soldier not to smoke. So really it tells us not too much. It's interesting that the older soldier had tobacco stains. And then Grave 6, 19 to 24, another young kid. So these were mostly young boys, young men who went off to war. I found this very interesting, and part of the forensic analysis, you can determine the diet of the soldiers. And sometimes the diet shows regions of where that person may have come from. So the diet primarily of all these soldiers included grain, possible seafood, but not much red meat. They were also excluded from being European. Doug commented on that. Based on the diet, they did not have a European diet. He felt the diet leaned towards the south just because of the grains. But it's possible in the urban or the rural areas in the New England or in the north, they also had grain diets. I mentioned to Dr. Owsley, I've got plenty of evidence of corn and corn diets in New England. So it was kind of inconclusive, really. It's kind of interesting to know what they ate, but it didn't really tell us much about them. So with all of that, the grave evidence and the forensic evidence, we compiled a list of clues and questions that we wanted to go through to help identify these guys. And quite frankly, I did not think we would have any hope of finding out who these guys fought for, any kind of identifying information, except I really felt they were Union soldiers. But I'm going to step you through this, and by the time we get to the bottom, we've got names tied to the soldiers. Kind of amazing how the process worked. I can't take credit. There was a historian named Dalton Rector who went through this with the archaeologist Mike Johnson and kind of compiled the clues and the evidence. And it's really interesting. I'll just quickly run through the list, and we'll go and analyze each one. It's like, we know they were killed in battle, so what were the battles near Centreville? Which battles could they have been killed in? That could help answer some questions. I mentioned there were pine boards. Why were the bodies buried in coffins? That was very uncommon in the Civil War, to bury a battle casualty, a battle death in a coffin. This was very perplexing. Why were the soldiers buried in a Confederate camp? Were the buttons Union or Confederate? Well, we know they were predominantly Union. One soldier was buried with athletic shoes. That's kind of interesting. One had a shoulder button. Who fired buck and ball in the Civil War and when? Was the souvenir Arrowhead from Northern Virginia? If it was from Georgia or from Maine, that could tell us a location of the soldiers. Does the diet help? Probably not. Are there records of soldiers being buried on that site? Well, the records of the Civil War are immense, and that hill is not named. So I didn't think it was likely that we'd find any evidence of written evidence that the soldiers were buried exactly on that site. And of course, can the ages be used to match records? So what are the battles that occurred near Centreville? If you're a Civil War historian, there really are 4 main battles. And the first one is not widely known. Battle of Blacksburn's Ford. It predated First Manassas. It was at Bull Run where Route 28 crosses, 2 miles from the burial site. Battle of First Manassas, we've all heard of that, is about 5 miles from the burial site. Second Manassas was 6 miles from the burial site. And the Battle of Chantilly, which actually is located at Fairfax Town Center. If you ever go to Fairfax Town Center, unfortunately a strip mall was built on the battlefield. That was about 4 miles from the burial site. So what we have is we just know that Blackburn's Ford is 2 miles away, would be the closest to take soldiers for burial. Now, why were the bodies buried in coffins? Coffins can only be procured and used for burial if the Army holds the field after the battle. If you're on the retreat, if you're running, you're not going to be burying your soldiers in coffins. You're going to be either leaving them on the field or hastily burying them in the ground. So obviously, these guys had held the field after battle, or were not in any rush to retreat. That's probably a better way of putting it. Also, coffin burials were very uncommon. Second Manassas had 3,300 men killed. You can't procure 3,300 coffins after the battle and bury everyone. Antietam had 3,600. So it had to be battle with very few casualties. We found out that after the Battle of Blackburn's Ford, Union troops held the field for 3 days. So we're thinking it's possible after that battle, they had enough time to get the coffins and bury their men. The other 3 battles, First Manassas, Second Manassas, and Chantilly, was a horrible rout. The Union troops were on the retreat to Washington. They had no time to even bury their dead. They left their dead on the field. In addition, the death count at Blackburn's Ford was small. It was in the dozens, less than 36. So again, our evidence is starting to seem like these soldiers probably were killed in the Battle of Blackburn's Ford. So that's helping a little bit. Now, why were soldiers buried in camp? Everyone who ever does archaeology or relic hunting, you never bury your dead in the camp. You just don't. It doesn't happen. And if the camp's abandoned, you're not going to want to go into an old camp and bury your dead there either. You go to a different site. So it led us to the conclusion the Confederate camp that was the winter of 1861-62 must have been set up after the burial. Well, would they want to camp with grave markers? Well, the firewood was so scant that those grave markers were probably used as firewood or removed long before the Confederates came to camp. And also, if you look at the date of Blackburn's Ford, it occurred 5 months before the Confederates even set up their camp in Centreville. So that makes sense. Now it's looking likely that Blackburn's Ford is the battle these soldiers were killed in because their dead had been buried on a hill, forgotten, grave markers burned, and the Confederates then camped, left all their artifacts for us to relic hunt, which later led to the discovery of the grave. So we're thinking Blackburn's Ford. So uniform buttons, Union or Confederate? Well, the buttons were Union. They were eagle buttons. But Confederates also wore them. But what Confederates wore were about every style of button imaginable. When we metal detected that Louisiana camp, it was like almost no 2 buttons were the same. Every style of Louisiana, every style of civilian button, they had everything on. So to find 6 soldiers dressed the same really told us they were Union soldiers. Had they been Louisiana soldiers, first of all, they wouldn't have been buried in camp, but if they were, they would have had a wide variety of button types. So the evidence definitely supports these are Union soldiers. Now, why was one soldier buried with athletic shoes? We had to do research on this because we didn't know our shoes very well. But the data was there. In the Northeast cities of New England, athletic shoes were popular. They were associated with club-level sports. Baseball was very popular during the Civil War period. And it was also noted that the shoes were not ever issued to soldiers. And really, quite frankly, if you ever look at photos and data, I've got a lot of friends who are historians, you don't really see soldiers anywhere in photos wearing athletic shoes. So it was very unusual. And we felt like the evidence pointed that it was probably a new soldier just enlisting. And it probably was a soldier from New England who went to war in his comfortable baseball shoes, had not yet been issued boots. That's basically the conclusion we came to. The South, they didn't wear club-level athletic shoes. They had boots. So again, Union is where we think the soldiers came from. So this was kind of a very interesting piece of evidence. You know, what type of uniform had the shoulder button? That is a very early style uniform. It was not worn much at all in the Civil War. You don't see it really in that many photos. It was sort of a militia uniform from the North. And one of our historian friends said, oh yeah, the 1st Massachusetts definitely had that uniform and shows up in the photos with those buttons on the shoulder. So suddenly we're thinking, 1st Massachusetts, let's see if they were the Battle of Blackburn's Ford. Well, they were. So now we're thinking, okay, not only are they Union, they're probably 1st Massachusetts soldiers. The uniform matches, the shoes pointing from New England, the club-level shoes matches, and they were at the battle that we think the soldiers were killed. So we've got a pretty good strong lead going here. So who fired buck and ball in the Civil War? Well, both sides did at the beginning of the war, but by the 2nd year, if you ever looked at Civil War history of guns, the rifled musket became extremely popular. They went to single projectile guns that fired a lot farther. It kind of changed the battle methodology of the Civil War. It used to be a very close, up-close type of battle that now could be waged for hundreds of yards away. And both sides went to rifled muskets. So this supports the fact it's probably an early battle since both sides had the buck and ball. And again, it points to Blackburn's Ford, July 18th, 1861, the opening days of the Civil War. So let's look at the Arrowhead. I talked to the archaeologists. It was a common Virginia arrowhead. So really, it was not from any other region. It does not give us any evidence. It was picked up probably as a souvenir. But the one thing I mentioned, which is only circumstantial, if you think of a battle-hardened Civil War soldier who's been on the road, on the march for months, if not years, is he going to be looking at cool rocks going, oh, that looks like an arrowhead. Let me pick it up and put it in my pocket? Probably not. You get a new soldier coming down, never been in Virginia, on his first march into battle, looking at the sights and sounds, has not seen the horrors of war. He might be more apt to pick up an arrowhead as a souvenir as he's walking towards Bull Run. So that's just a thought, but it really adds not much evidence to our analysis. Now, what about the forensic diet? Not really. It doesn't help too much. Even though Dr. Owsley felt like it led more to a Southern soldier, it's not conclusive because the Northern soldiers did eat corn and grain. What it told you was it's probably not a bunch of rich soldiers who ate beef every day. That's basically all it told you. So this is where it gets really interesting. So are there really records of soldiers being buried at that site in Centreville? There's too many records of the Civil War to scan through and try to pick out a hill just south of the intersection, main intersection in Centreville, burial sites. But if you have some clues like we did that we think they're the 1st Massachusetts because they were there and the uniforms matched, we can pull their regimental history, which is quite vast, but it's readable. I mean, we can read 200 pages. We can't read 200,000 pages. So we started reading the 1st Massachusetts regimental history, and lo and behold, they describe burying their dead on a hilltop just south. They mentioned the number of feet from the main part of town, which matched the exact location where we found it. So that almost confirms with the uniform evidence, the battle evidence, and the fact in their own regimental history, they talk about burying their dead there. We really feel strongly, and everyone felt strongly, these soldiers were from the 1st Massachusetts. And what was interesting, because it was the first war, the first battle, the first time they'd seen anyone killed, they wrote a lot of stuff about it. Had this been in 1863 and you had maybe 12 guys killed, it would barely have made a 3 or 4 line report. But the fact that these were the first soldiers killed in the Civil War, they wrote pages. They told about how the moon was over the grave site as they were digging the grave shafts, how they could hear the guns in the distance from 1st Manassas. They could hear the retreating soldiers coming up Warrenton Turnpike. It was really interesting. Also, the newspapers of New England covered this particular battle, Battle of Blackburn's Ford, very closely. It was the first battle. So it was covered as if it were Gettysburg. So there's a lot of data about these men, the battle, how they fought, how they died, what their parents felt about it, and it's very fascinating. Probably a whole different presentation in itself. But it really gave us a lot of evidence that we felt these soldiers that we just dug up in Centreville were 1st Massachusetts soldiers. So now this is where forensic comes in really helpful, because in the 1st Massachusetts, only 9 soldiers were killed. We do have evidence in the regimental history. One was buried in a church graveyard, because they weren't killed all at the same time. About 7 or 8 were killed in the first day of Blackburn's Ford. But their ages have to match. We have the ages, forensic ages of these graves. If they're, 5 guys in their 30s who are killed, obviously it's not 1st Massachusetts. Well, lo and behold, the dead match the ages of the forensic, the ages on the roster match the forensic ages. And there's a couple names where we could kind of flip-flop, but not so much. So you can almost put a name to a grave just based on the forensic age that Dr. Owsley determined and the age on the roster of the soldiers who were killed. And what I found extremely interesting and pretty conclusive was the guy wearing the athletic shoes in grave 6 was documented to have been a club baseball player in Boston. So that kind of confirms it. The other piece that was very interesting, and Dalton Rector found this, Albert Wentworth, he signed up in Boston in April of 1861 as 18 years old. He was really 17. Pull up Ancestry.com and find his birth record. He lied about his age. So if you remember, grave 2 was 16 to 18. Well, here's Albert at 17. So the ages match up very well. So those vague set of clues, those just generic questions that we just went through, suddenly we have actual names for the graves, which kind of blew us away. Now, you need DNA testing to actually confirm it, which no one did. But the data was pretty conclusive. They were 1st Massachusetts. So like I said, the historic data supports it. The forensic data does. We talked about doing DNA testing. It was kind of expensive back in late 90s. But given the evidence, the state of Massachusetts and the U.S. military accepted the data and the conclusions, accepted the fact they were 1st Massachusetts, and arranged for a burial at the National Cemetery in Bourne, full military honors. And that is the next piece of the story. And it was quite an event. You had basically hundreds of reenactors showing up. You had the United States military showing up as a full military burial. And they all came together for this huge ceremony. So here's the parade coming up the road. You had the fife and drum corps leading the way. This is only one photo of the Civil War reenactor widows and mothers, but there were a number of these ladies who were in the procession, mourning. You had the pallbearers for each casket. They were custom made out of pine to match the pine boxes the soldiers were buried in. They were laid out with U.S. flags. You had the honor guard, both the reenactors and the military. The coffins ready for burial. And they were put into the ground with unknown tombstones. I meant to get a photo of that, but I didn't get a chance to get into the presentation. There was talk that at later time, they could easily be exhumed and DNA testing could be done. Dalton Rector identified family members who are willing to give up their DNA samples to see if they matched. No one really has the motivation, money, or desire to do it. We're just kind of comfortable with the fact that they're 1st Massachusetts. We probably have their names mostly correct, but maybe not quite. And they're just unknown 1st Massachusetts now in Bourne. So at this point, it takes us to 2006 for the burial. But what about the soldiers themselves? What happened with the 1st Massachusetts? I mentioned that there was a lot of data written about these men, a lot of information, and it was their first time in war. And I took this right out of the regimental history, and what I kind of find funny is they call the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run the first blunder at Bull Run. No one was happy at the outcome if you were a Union soldier or sympathizer of what that battle turned into. It turned into a huge retreat, the Great Skedaddle. But if you start out, the men enlisted in late April and early May of 1861. And like I said, mostly young men. And it was a huge celebration, both North and South. Parades, speeches, parties, singing. So many men enlisted that in the regimental history they wrote they had a hard time finding places to camp. They were constantly shuffling, trying to find fresh water, areas where they could spread out. What's interesting is they never had trouble with food. Everyone wanted to give them food. They were probably better fed as a soldier than before they enlisted because the whole public was just abuzz with the fact that these guys were going off to war. Everyone thought the war would be ended in one battle. Both sides thought they were going to be victorious, and there was just a lot of pomp and circumstance at the time. Well, when it finally came time to June, and they were sent south, they were sent to Washington. And they went off with huge parades, women kissing them, girlfriends crying. There was all kinds of descriptions about going off, trying to shove all the food into their backpacks, knapsacks that they were given for the trip. They couldn't carry all the food that was given to them. Again, it was just a big party going off to war. None of the horrors had happened yet. Lots of marching bands. Well, these men traveled in comfort. Everyone was volunteering their trains and boats, and any way they could get down to Washington the quickest, they chose. They went on the steamship Commonwealth, part of their journey. They went on trains, other parts, and they kind of town hopped. And as they went from town to town on their travels, everywhere they stopped, they were greeted at the stations or the dock with cheering people, pulling them into banquets, more speeches. More talk of quick victory, and again the men feasted and just ate. They didn't even need their own supplies. And they traveled, occasionally one guy had to lay on the floor of a boat that they mentioned in the history, but they traveled in comfort. They weren't marching to Washington. They were taking trains and boats. Well, it was all fine and dandy until they hit Baltimore, Maryland. And Baltimore was a southern city. New York City, Groton, Connecticut, Boston, one of the other cities they stopped in, all welcomed them with speeches and parades and feasts. Baltimore, when the first group of Massachusetts soldiers went right before the first, it was the 6th Massachusetts, they were greeted with bricks and bottles. The guys, untested, fired upon the civilians, killed a couple civilians, and it made big news. So when the 1st Massachusetts arrived in Baltimore to travel through, they all loaded their weapons. And they all marched ready for battle just because they were in Baltimore, Maryland. And they were followed by these huge groups of citizens with angry looks in their faces, but never a shot was fired or a brick was thrown. They was sort of a standoff, a stare-off. But they were basically walked out of town by these groups of civilians. They were not welcomed in Baltimore, and they didn't stop for food or anything. They made it through, and they ultimately did the final march from Baltimore down to Washington. And when they arrived in Washington, they were quite disappointed. There was no pomp, there was no circumstance, there was no food, there was no shelter. They just were there, and it's like, now what do we do? And they talked about how they were hungry, how they went scavenging food. Some slept in warehouses. Some found abandoned houses to sleep in. It was very disorganized. They were not used to the military life yet, and they'd been quite spoiled and pampered on most of the journey and most of the time they enlisted. So they finally set up camp. It was a little like Boston, where there were so many men pouring into D.C. for the first battle. They were having trouble finding places to camp. So ultimately, the 1st Massachusetts went out to Georgetown, which was a distant suburb of Washington at that time. And they found a nice field with a spring where they camped. And they stayed there for a little while. Spent the 4th of July there. At the 4th of July, parties erupted throughout Washington. Every unit, every company of soldiers, there's probably tens of thousands of soldiers in Washington set off huge bonfires. And it looked like the entire city was on fire from these bonfires. They all sang patriotic songs, and it was this huge all-night party, 4th of July, 1861. They had to start doing drills. Drills were a big drag for these soldiers. They had not really drilled yet. They had not done anything military. They'd just been partying and eating a lot, and now they were getting down to the battle. So, or preparing for battle, I should say. So ultimately, plans were made, which led to First Manassas, and they were organized and given sort of orders that they were going to be marching out of Washington. But before they marched out of Washington, they had to get reviewed by President Lincoln. So they, with the other soldiers, marched in file in front of the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue. Here's Lincoln, and were reviewed by President Lincoln days before they went off to battle. So the soldiers we dug marched in front of President Lincoln days before they were killed in battle. And that was a big deal for them. This was a sketch that I found of the event in 1861. And they went back to camp after being reviewed by Lincoln. And finally, orders were given to march to battle. And this is not really in a lot of history books. It was in the regimental history. And the regimental history was just fascinating. Like I said, the opening days of the war, they wrote about as if it was going to be the only part of the war. Lots of details. There was a massive traffic jam of soldiers leaving Washington. There really was only one road out. Think of like 66. One road, one bridge. These soldiers, it took hours to cross the bridge to get out of D.C. Once they got marching, they were marching at a pace that they said was so painfully slow, it would have been easier to walk fast or stand still. Some soldiers were trying to skirt around through the brush. A few tried to find alternate routes, but it was all day just to get out past Arlington, where Arlington is today. And ultimately, they set up camp at night, probably near East Falls Church, somewhere in that area. The next day, they went down to Bull Run, near Union Mills, near Clifton, and camped. And ironically, I'd relic hunted their camp and found a Massachusetts button and probably for an officer, and one of their unique breastplates. So I actually had previously hunted their camp, didn't know it at the time. From there, they were sent to Centreville on the third day. And once they got to Centreville, the soldiers were very hot, they were very thirsty, they were hungry because they'd already eaten their rations. And most of the soldiers were distracted by picking blackberries. So July 18th, blackberries were plentiful in Northern Virginia and very ripe, and they had issues keeping the soldiers marching and not eating blackberries. They were having issues with water, being thirsty. They got to Centreville. These men, and it was noted in the regimental history, they were not in shape. They had not marched. They had not drilled. These were guys who just enlisted a few months earlier, had been eating a lot of food traveling south, and a lot of them were overweight. They mentioned some overweight soldiers really struggling on this march, because still it's a good march if you think about it. If you had to walk from here in D.C. all the way up to Centreville, even if it would take 3 days, it's still a lot of marching. They get to Centreville, and they're sent down to explore Blackburn's Ford. They're preparing for battle. The commanders of the Union Army are trying to figure out, where should we attack? There are a number of fords along Bull Run. We know we need to engage the Confederates. So the 1st Massachusetts, who arrived in Centreville, was sent to just explore, check out, not even to go to battle, but check out what's happening down at Blackburn's Ford. So it's another 2-mile march. They complained about 2 miles being long and hot and thirsty and a dusty road, which Route 28 was a dusty road at that point. Well, when they got there, some of the officers were really sort of itching for battle, itching for action. I mean, they hadn't seen any. So they start lobbing cannon fire over Bull Run to kind of test out if the Confederates are there. Immediately, cannon fire answered, and balls started bouncing across the ground. Everyone took cover. No discipline. These guys had never been fired upon before. It was just run for cover. And they finally gathered the men, kind of organized them and said, we're going to act like an army. We're going to march forward and check out the ford. And they decided to take a route through the woods so they couldn't be seen. They couldn't be shot at by the cannons in open fields. Well, the cannon fire drew the Confederates across Bull Run to check out what was going on. So you had a group of Virginians waiting in the woods, hidden well hidden. And here come the 1st Massachusetts, walking through the woods to try to check out the ford, and at almost point-blank range, they were opened up with buck and ball, and a number of them were mowed down. You had about half of the 18, maybe half were injured, and half were killed. They fired back, some reinforcements were sent in. There was a lot of comments about the soldiers were very inaccurate, even at close range. There were a lot of comments about a lot of the soldiers, as soon as the first gunfire happened, they just ran. So it was not an organized army at all, but you did have a number of casualties. The Confederates did eventually go back across to the southern side, on the Manassas side, and the men were retrieved. They were put in wagons, they called them ambulance wagons, and sent up to Centreville. A couple of them who weren't quite dead were sent to these little hospital buildings and separated from the dead. One later died and was buried at a churchyard on the north side of Centreville. A couple recovered and were sent, or survived, I should say, and were sent home. The men of the 1st Massachusetts held the field. They established a little picket camp down at Bull Run. They occasionally fired bullets in a cannonball, but never again did they really engage in battle. It was more of a cat and mouse, waiting to see where the big battle was to occur. They weren't sure if the big battle of 1st Manassas was going to be at Blackburn's Ford. Ultimately, the commanders of the Union Army decided Blackburn's Ford is kind of hilly, it's kind of well defended, and we didn't have very good luck just testing it out. They decided to go down the Warrenton Turnpike towards where you now have the Stone Bridge, the Manassas Battlefield Park, and make the main offensive there. But meanwhile, the 1st Massachusetts was left to guard Blackburn's Ford. So come day 3, they're still holding the battlefield. They've arranged for the burial of their men. They've got the caskets. And they hear the cannons in the distance. The battle has started. They're not part of it. They start opening fire across the ford just out of spirit. And I think one guy was actually killed by a sniper at long range. So another individual from the 1st Massachusetts was killed. They are ordered back to Centreville. So they pull back to Centreville, and they start their burial by moonlight. And the battle is coming closer, and they start seeing Union soldiers in complete disarray. It's just a total rout. The retreat is not disciplined. It's every man for himself. Units are separated. They're civilians. You probably heard the history, how many civilians went down to picnic and watch the battle and got caught up in the retreat. It was just a horrible scene, and ultimately, they were quite confused at how bad it looked. They finished their little burial, they said a little prayer, and they joined the retreat. And ultimately, they got broken up and separated, and it took them all night. They talked about the bad conditions of the retreat, and then meeting back up eventually and reestablishing their camp. And at that point, everyone knew it was not going to be a quick and easy war. And the men were left on the battlefield. There's a scene from this was actually shot at 1st Manassas, but it would have been looking very similar to what would have happened at Blackburn's Ford. This was an 1861 shot from July 21st. And this was labeled, it's a Library of Congress shot, Bull Run Dead. Wooden stones or wooden head markers after the battle. So it's possible, and that's very common. I've got other photos that show just sort of wooden markers. And they're very easily removed, fallen down, burned as firewood. So it's easy to see how if you had markers like that on a hilltop in Centreville with soldiers passing through on a daily basis, the wood could get removed very easily and the graves forgotten, which is most likely what happened. So the retreat, like I mentioned, was just this horrendous, disorganized, mad dash at night back to D.C. Later, one of the family members came, and the soldier who was killed, or he was injured and then died at the hospital site and buried in the church graveyard, the family did exhume him and bring him back to Massachusetts. But no one ever made an effort to go back and find the graveyard on the hill to take any of those soldiers back home. What was also interesting, one other note, the mayor of the town that most of the boys, or many of the boys in Company G had volunteered from, he made a personal trip down to Washington to talk to the boys, to express his condolence, his sympathy for their losses. He made trips to the parents as well. He was very involved as a mayor. And obviously, it was the first casualties of the war, and that stopped, once the casualty rate, went to the tens of thousands with other battles. So we were able to pull the photos of the soldiers. It was in the regimental history. And here's Albert Wentworth, our 16 to 18. Actually, he was 17 and faked his age as 18. And I can't remember, I think this is Smart, and one of the other soldiers that was killed. But it's kind of interesting to put a face to the actual grave and the information of the soldiers that we found. And ultimately, the information, I kind of went quickly over the history of the 1st Massachusetts. That itself is probably worthy of an in-depth presentation of just their experiences and some of what they encountered on the march, on the road, and in the battle. And that might be an effort I do later on. But for tonight, that was kind of the history of solving the mystery and the story behind the soldiers and their background.